Hi, this is Brock Dickinson, and today I'm coming to you from my office. And I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about President Trump and his threats to impose a 25% tariff on all goods flowing out of Canada into the United States, and the sort of the chaos that this has caused in Canada-US relations. It's a big set of issues, and it's going to be a while before we have total clarity on this. But as a starting point, I think we need to talk a little bit about the motivation of the White House in this context. And your sense of that might differ a little bit based on your political perspectives. Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman has said that this is just the chaos monkeys back at work, and that the Trump administrations, past and present, have always thrived on chaos. Now, if you're more pro-Trump than Mr. Krugman is, you might see this as evidence of President Trump being crazy like a fox, that there's some strategy behind the chaos that's been handed out at the moment. And all of this kind of relates to understanding what's the best possible negotiating position when you're trying to arrange new trade relationships and trade deals. And the theories here go back half a millennium or more. Back in the 1500s, Machiavelli, for example, wrote about how it was a very wise thing to simulate madness, that if you pretended you were crazy, you could often get your opponents, your enemies, to back down and run away. And in fact, in modern politics, this is often known as the Madman Theory. This was something that President Nixon, for example, in the 1970s, really embraced strongly when he was dealing with communist bloc countries around the world. He wanted them to believe that he was irrational and volatile because they would back down in negotiations. And so there are some who have said that this is really President Trump style. And when he talks about making Canada the 51st state, it's just part of this game of being crazy, but crazy like a fox, that it's laying out some sort of a negotiating position. The problem is that when you do that, it kind of fits into a whole historical context that the political leadership isn't always aware of. And so talking about making Canada the 51st state falls into this American historical narrative of manifest destiny, this idea that America was foreordained by God to control the entire North American continent, and that all it needed to do was sort of bide its time and this would come to pass. And so this resonates in some US circles as an active plan. Hey, look, we're finally going to do it. Canada's going to become a 51st state. This is wonderful. North of the border, it also resonates, but in opposite ways, because President Trump is not the first president to kind of talk about taking over, annexing, controlling Canada. Thomas Jefferson famously said back in 1812 that the acquisition of Canada this year will be a mere matter of marching. And as a result of those comments, we ended up in the War of 1812. President Polk in the 1840s ran on the campaign slogan 54-40 or fight, that we're going to set the border 54 degrees, 40 minutes north of the equator. And if we don't get that, we're going to stage a war with the Canadians to sort of take it away from them. In fact, the border is at the 49th parallel, so we didn't go as far north as 54-40. But you can imagine that saying we're going to take that 5 degrees between 49 and 54 upset some Canadians back in the mid-1800s as they sort of expected American armies to cross the border. This kind of Canadian fear or paranoia of what the U.S. is going to do has also really shaped Canadian politics. Back in 1988, when Canada first signed a free trade agreement with the United States, there was an election fought exactly on that issue, in which Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney ran against Liberal leader John Turner. And Mulroney was pro-free trade. We're going to sign a free trade agreement with the United States because trade is good for both of our countries. Turner and his Liberal Party took the opposite approach and said, no, we can't sign a free trade deal with the U.S. because we can't trust them. And ultimately, they're just going to screw us over, and this will be bad for Canada in the long run. And in taking those two positions, although they might have flip-flopped from the perspective of which party was arguing which case, they were refighting one of the most intense and difficult elections in Canadian history, the 1911 general election, in which Conservative leader Borden ran opposing free trade, and Liberal leader Wilfrid Laurier ran in favor of free trade. That was a hard-fought election that was won by the Conservatives, who didn't want free trade, who wanted Canada to keep its economy separate from the U.S. But one of the interesting things about that election is some of the ideas that came forward very strongly with it. So one of the key conservative slogans in that election was, "No truck or trade with Yankees." We will not trade with the United States. We will not engage with what's going on south of the border because that's how we're going to protect the Canadian economy. Interestingly, in that election, places like Ontario voted conservative, voted against free trade, and places like Alberta voted liberal and voted for free trade. And you can still hear echoes of that today. I mean, one of the reactions to Trump's sort of suggestions of the 51st state and all these tariff charges was Ontario Premier Doug Ford saying, hey, we're going to retaliate. We're going to sort of turn this into a battle. We're going to make this tough for the Americans, echoing that traditional conservative line about not wanting to integrate the two economies. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith took that traditional Alberta perspective and said, can't we all just get along? Can't we find a way to kind of make this work? We'll figure out this problem, and we'll be able to collaborate together in the longer run. And so here we are 115 years later after that election, and we can still hear echoes of those issues in current Canadian political debates and discussions. Now, the real sort of core of what's going on this time around is that Donald Trump wants to impose, or has said that he wants to impose, 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. And a tariff is essentially a tax imposed by one country on the goods and services imported from another country to influence that country, to raise revenues for your own country, or to protect your competitive advantage. And in fact, the United States has a long history of utilizing tariffs. They haven't been very common since about 1946, 1947, but prior to that, the U.S. used tariffs a lot, going back to the 1820s and the Tariff of Abominations, which is like a fantastic name for a set of tariffs. But in general, the U.S. government has tended to use tariffs for two reasons. First, if you have a lot of imports coming into your country, charging tariffs can generate revenue for the government. And this is clearly part of Donald Trump's strategy. He has established an external revenue service to collect this new revenue that he's going to get. And the notion is that he needs new revenues because cutting costs in the American government is a big preoccupation. We think of how he's engaged Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to cut government costs overall. If they can generate new revenues from tariffs, that will be an extra win. In fact, Trump imposed tariffs in his first term, but the tariffs that he's looking at now are about 7 times larger in terms of their impacts. However, even though they're going to be larger this time around, they really don't generate the kinds of income that are going to solve the American budget problems. We can expect that they'll generate about $3.3 trillion in income, which is about 10% of what income tax generally raises each year for the United States government. So it's not insignificant, but it's not going to have the impacts that they want. The second reason that you might want to impose tariffs if you're the U.S. government is that if you have high enough tariffs, it can stimulate domestic production. That's basically a fancy way of saying that, when you impose tariffs on another country, it makes their goods more expensive. So maybe you can start a domestic industry. In the age of globalization, we generally moved things to be manufactured or built or made wherever they were cheapest. And we all benefited from that, from having low-cost goods made in China, made in Mexico, made in Taiwan, wherever they came from. It was cheaper to make them there, and so we paid less for things. Imposing a tariff on those goods makes them more expensive. But because they're more expensive, there is the opportunity now to start a domestic industry. If you don't have to make them in the cheapest possible place anymore because you've inflated the prices, suddenly domestic manufacturing looks like a possibility. And the question mark in this becomes, is that sort of higher price that we pay for everything as a result going to kill the economy? Or will there be enough new jobs created that we might be able to kind of find a way to thread the needle and actually achieve some economic growth? That's an open question. Nobody knows what the answer to that is, and there's sort of loud arguments on both sides of the table on that one. This ultimately means that the economic case for tariffs is somewhat limited. We really don't know if they're going to work the way anybody intends them to, and that leads to this sense that this is really crazy like a fox, that we're really talking about trade negotiations using tariffs as a threat to kind of get what you want from the process. And this makes sense in the context of President Trump accelerating the renegotiation of the USMCA agreement from 2026 to 2025. that now there's a reason to think that the United States might have been throwing its weight around versus Canada and even Mexico, because they want to kind of have a good negotiating position going into these trade discussions. And because they think they're in a good position now, they're going to go into those discussions early. The risk here is that while you're acting crazy like a fox or pursuing the madman theory, that people don't always respond the way you expect they might, and accidents can happen. Back in 1828, when the US government imposed the Tariff of Abominations that I mentioned earlier, this actually happened by accident. This was not something that anybody intended to do. It was a bit of a game of chicken going on in the American Congress, and there was a proposal put on the floor to add a 38% tariff on imported goods and a 45% tariff on imported raw materials. And in the midst of the shenanigans on the floor of the Congress, it accidentally got passed. And in fact, once it had passed, it almost caused the Civil War to break out in the United States 40 years ahead of time. That the impacts of these tariffs on some communities across the United States were so bad that it turned into a bit of a political disaster. And the danger is that we might end up with something like the Tariff of Abominations again, completely by accident. So what can we do in this context? How do we avoid falling into the trap of the Tariff of Abominations? Well, if you're American, I would say you need to speak to your political leaders and urge some degree of caution. One of the challenges is you start talking about the 51st state, and those crazy folks up north are going to get wound up like feral wolverines, right? There's this sense that you can't predict how they're going to respond, and the responses might not be great. And so talking tough is a good negotiating strategy, unless it gets taken as too tough by the other side of the table. If you're European and you're watching this, I guess my suggestion would be stop laughing, because you're up next. Like, you're not dealing with this yet, but you will be. Mark my words, in 6 or 12 months, once Donald Trump figures out what he's doing with Canada and Mexico, Europe is up next on the block. And so get used to these kinds of discussions, because they're coming to a neighborhood near you. And finally, if you're Canadian, well, you need to start to get your act together here. After 9/11, when the US panicked about security at its borders, one of the first things that it did was to shut down international entries, particularly at places like the Mexican-American border or the Canadian-American border. And they came to Canada and said, we need to do something to increase security. And the interesting thing at the time was that Canada had a series of plans in place for border modernization that had been blocked by the US government for many years. But it meant that when the US came knocking, they had a strategy already articulated, already written down to say, hey, here's what we should do at the border. And instead of being blocked, it was implemented within a matter of months. That having that specific plan that spoke to American concerns meant that it got implemented almost immediately. So Canada, have a plan. Have something that you want to do that's going to be a win-win on both sides of the borders, and impose that or interject that into the negotiations. Second, as big as these tariffs are that will block trade between Canada and the US, the interprovincial trade barriers in Canada are just as big. It is crazy how much people do to impose barriers to trade within the context of Canada. And while you're panicking about what's going on in terms of Canada-US trade, you need to be thinking about what's happening in terms of trade between individual provinces.